The wind came whispering through the pines that morning, carrying with it the scent of dust and wild sage. The sun had barely risen above the ridges, casting long shadows across the valley where a single log cabin stood, lonely and quiet, except for the creak of an old wooden gate and the sound of a woman drawing water from the well. She had lived out there for months, away from the townsfolk, away from the noise of men and their quarrels. Life had been hard but peaceful. She had her small garden, her chickens, and the land that gave her just enough to survive. But that morning everything changed. The stillness broke when she heard the faint sound of hooves in the distance. Not the steady rhythm of a rider coming to visit, but the uneven, desperate clatter of a horse pushed to its limits. She turned toward the open plain, hand shading her eyes. A rider appeared from the heat waves, slumped, swaying, barely holding on. The closer he came, the clearer it became that he was no settler, no ranch hand. His skin was bronze under the dirt and blood, his long black hair tangled with dust, and the red markings painted across his chest had been smeared by sweat and injury. He was Apache. Her heart jumped. Stories of raids, killings, and burned-out homesteads had filled every campfire tale from the towns to the border. Folks said you couldn't trust an Apache, but as she watched him stumble from his saddle and fall to the ground near her fence, she didn't see a warrior or an enemy. She saw a man dying of thirst. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow, his eyes half open as if clinging to the edge of life. For a long moment, she stood frozen, torn between fear and compassion. She could have turned away. Nobody would have blamed her. Yet something inside her refused to let him die like that. She carried her bucket, knelt beside him and lifted his head gently. His skin burned with fever, and his pulse fluttered weakly beneath her fingers. The man tried to speak, but only a rough whisper came out. She held the cup to his lips and he drank, trembling as the cool water touched his mouth. When he finally managed to open his eyes, she saw more than pain there. She saw confusion, maybe disbelief. She could tell he didn't expect kindness from someone like her. His gaze lingered, uncertain, like a wild creature unsure whether it had found mercy or a trap. She said nothing. Words didn't matter much out there. She cleaned his wounds as best she could, tearing one of her old shirts into strips for bandages. She saw the gunshot wound on his side, the blood crusted dark along his ribs. Whoever had done it hadn't stayed to finish the job. By evening, she had him resting on a bed of blankets near the fireplace. His breathing had steadied, and she'd placed his weapons, a bow, a knife, and a small pouch of beads, just within his reach. She wasn't foolish enough to take them away. A man like that would need to see trust before he gave it back. All through the night, she couldn't sleep. The flames from the hearth flickered across the walls, and outside the coyotes howled. She kept thinking about what she had done. Helping a wounded Apache was enough to get her branded a traitor in any nearby town. If soldiers or scouts came by and found him there, she could lose everything. But what was she supposed to do? Leave him out in the dirt to die? Sometime before dawn, she heard him stir. He sat up slowly, grimacing, eyes scanning the small cabin. He seemed to understand that she had tended to him, though the suspicion in his eyes remained sharp as a knife. She offered him more water, and he took it silently. Neither spoke. The firelight glowed between them, a fragile bridge over a deep divide of fear and mistrust. When morning came, he tried to stand but nearly fell. She helped him to the doorway so he could breathe the morning air. His horse was gone, probably wandered off during the night. She watched him look toward the hills as though expecting something, or someone to appear. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment his hand brushed the knife at his side. She sensed his unease and wondered if danger was following him. After he sat back down, she asked softly, "You need food?" He didn't answer, but accepted the bread she handed him. His fingers shook as he tore it apart, eating slowly, cautiously, as though unsure whether he could trust what she gave him. When he finished, he looked at her and touched his chest lightly, then pointed toward her heart. It was a small gesture, thanks maybe. She nodded. The day passed quietly. He slept most of it, regaining some color. She went about her chores but never stopped glancing toward the woods. There was a heaviness in the air, something she couldn't name. The birds were too silent and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By sunset, he was strong enough to move around. He tried to leave, but when he stepped outside, his legs faltered. She caught his arm before he could fall again. He looked at her with pride mixed with exhaustion and said something in his language, words she couldn't understand, but the tone told her enough. He didn't want her to follow. Still, she stood at the porch watching as he disappeared into the trees, the last light of the day casting him in gold and shadow. That night, the unease grew into dread. Her dog barked once, then twice before going silent. The moon hung high, cold and pale, and every sound in the woods seemed louder than before. She checked her door, bolted it tight, and set her rifle by the table. She tried to convince herself that the man was gone, that she'd done her part, and life would return to normal. But deep down she knew better. Nothing in the frontier ever stayed quiet for long. When dawn came again, she woke to the faint rumble of distant thunder. But the sky was clear. It wasn't thunder, it was the sound of hooves. Many of them. She stepped outside, heart pounding, and looked toward the horizon. A long line of riders was moving through the valley, their shapes dark against the morning light. She counted what she could, but they stretched too far. Dozens, maybe hundreds. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their horses. She ran back inside and grabbed her rifle, her mind racing. Who were they? Soldiers, bandits, or his people, the Apache, come to finish what he had started? As the riders drew closer, she saw their feathers, their painted faces, the glint of weapons in the sun. They surrounded her cabin like a tightening noose, their leader riding forward slowly. He stopped only a few feet from her gate, staring at her with a gaze she recognized, the same man she had given water to. His wound was bandaged, his face unreadable. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. She didn't know if he had come to protect her, or if she had just sealed her fate by saving his life. The only thing she knew for certain was that nothing in her quiet valley would ever be the same again. The air was heavy, the riders waiting, and somewhere between fear and faith, she stood frozen, her heart beating against the sound of 300 hooves pounding the earth. The air felt heavy, thick with silence as the Apache riders surrounded her cabin. Dust rose from the ground and hung in the morning light like smoke. The woman stood still on the porch, one hand gripping her rifle, though she knew it would do little against so many. Her heart raced, but her face stayed calm. The wounded warrior she had helped was sitting tall on his horse now, his eyes locked on hers. His expression gave away nothing, neither anger nor gratitude, just the unreadable calm of a man used to watching life and death ride side by side. She could hear the horses breathing, their hooves shifting restlessly. The smell of leather, sweat, and dust filled the air. Behind the warrior, the others fanned out like a sea of movement. Some young, some old, all armed. Spears gleamed in the sunlight, and their painted faces stared at her cabin as if weighing her worth. No one spoke. It was a silence sharper than any threat. She slowly lowered her rifle. If they wanted her dead, she thought, it would have already happened. The warrior raised his hand, a simple gesture, and one of the riders dismounted, walking toward the porch. He looked at her with stern, searching eyes. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, the kind that didn't waste words. She didn't understand his language, but she caught the tone. It was questioning. He pointed toward the cabin, then at her, then at the man on the horse. She could only nod. After a tense pause, the warrior gave a short command. The rider turned and spoke quickly to the others, and like that the tension began to shift. Some dismounted, others stayed alert, but no weapon was raised. The warrior dismounted last and walked slowly toward her, favoring his wounded side. He stopped a few steps from the porch, his gaze steady. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he lifted his hand slightly and placed it over his chest, the same gesture he had made the day before when she gave him water. Her fear loosened, but only slightly. She nodded again, unsure what else to do. He spoke a few words, his voice deep and quiet, then turned toward his people. Whatever he said made several of them glance at her with surprise. Some murmured among themselves, and a few looked toward the hills as though expecting danger from somewhere else. The woman's mind spun. She had no way of knowing what they planned or why they had come. All she could think was that she had helped a wounded man, and now found herself standing before an entire war party. The valley that once felt safe now seemed too open, too exposed. She had come to this land 2 years earlier, after losing her husband in a river crossing near Santa Fe. He had been trying to start a ranch, dreaming of a better life out west, but the land took him before the dream ever took root. With nowhere else to go, she stayed. The cabin they'd built together became her refuge, though it often felt more like a reminder of everything she had lost. The nearest settlement was a 2-day ride away, and visitors rarely came this far. She'd learned to be self-reliant, to split wood, mend fences, and keep to herself. But she had also learned the sounds of the wild, the cry of hawks, the whisper of coyotes, the distant echo of gunfire that sometimes rolled across the plains when soldiers clashed with raiding bands. Each sound had a meaning. Each silence carried a warning. And this silence, now thick and waiting, told her that something far bigger than her small cabin was unfolding. The warrior spoke again, this time pointing toward the hills. He made a motion like the swing of a rifle, then gestured toward her cabin in the open valley. Even without understanding, she could sense he was warning her. Maybe soldiers were coming, or maybe another tribe. The thought made her stomach tighten. If she had saved a man who was being hunted, then his enemies might soon come for him, and find her instead. He turned to his men, giving another command. Some of them began riding toward the ridge, scanning the horizon. Others stayed behind, forming a loose circle around the cabin. The warrior stepped up onto the porch, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at her bandaged hands, the ones that had tended his wound. He reached into a small pouch at his side and took out a piece of hide marked with red and black paint. He handed it to her. She hesitated, unsure if it was a gift or a warning. His eyes told her to keep it. She took it gently, her fingers trembling. The paint was still fresh and the pattern looked like a bird's wing stretched wide. When she looked up again, the warrior was already turning away. He mounted his horse with quiet strength despite the wound and signaled his men to move. Within moments, the valley filled again with the thunder of hooves. The riders moved fast and silent, their shapes fading into the dust until only the wounded warrior remained at the edge of her fence. He looked back once more, his face unreadable, and then he too vanished into the hills. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. She stood on the porch, clutching the painted hide, feeling as though the ground beneath her had changed. Something about his look told her this wasn't over. By afternoon, she had buried herself in chores to calm her nerves, feeding the chickens, checking the water barrel, trying to pretend life was normal. But the air still carried a strange stillness. The birds hadn't returned, and even the creek that ran past her property seemed quieter than usual. As night fell, she built a fire. Though the flames did little to chase away the unease, her thoughts kept circling back to the warrior's gesture toward the hills. Was there a fight coming? Was she caught between two enemies? She remembered stories from the traders, rumors that the army was planning to clear the nearby territory, driving the tribe south or into reservations. There had been skirmishes for months, raids on wagon trains and ambushes in the canyons. If soldiers came through the valley, they would find her cabin and maybe assume she was aiding their enemy. Before dawn, she was woken by the sound of distant gunfire. Faint but distinct, one shot, then another, then several more echoing through the hills. She sat up, her heart pounding. The dog growled low near the door. She grabbed her rifle and stepped outside. The horizon was still dark, but the sound came again, sharper this time. The fighting was close enough to make her hands tremble. The painted hide still lay on the table inside. She picked it up, staring at it as the gunfire faded. Maybe it was meant as protection, maybe a sign that the warrior had promised something she couldn't yet understand. But if the army was near, that promise might not matter. By mid-morning, smoke began to rise in the distance, a thin gray column twisting into the sky. It wasn't far from where the Apache had ridden. The valley that had once been her safe place now felt like a trap. She couldn't tell who was winning out there. But she knew one thing: both sides would come looking eventually. She packed a few things, some food, water, and the small revolver she kept hidden under the floorboard. But as she started to saddle her horse, she hesitated. If she left, she'd have nowhere to go and no one to trust. If she stayed, she risked being caught in whatever storm was brewing. She stood there in the open, torn between fear and stubbornness. Then she saw movement near the ridge again. Not a band of riders this time, but two figures on foot, one carrying a limp shape over his shoulder. As they drew closer, she recognized the wounded warrior leading the way. His face was hard, his clothes torn and bloodied again. Behind him, the man he carried wasn't moving. He stopped at her fence, his chest heaving. His eyes found hers, this time not as a stranger, but as someone who needed help again. Without a word, she opened the gate. He laid the other man down near the porch. The body was young, barely more than a boy, an arrow still lodged in his side. The warrior knelt beside him, pressing a hand to the wound, speaking softly in his language. She could feel the grief in his tone. She didn't understand the words, but she didn't have to. She ran inside, fetched water and cloth, and knelt beside them. The warrior didn't stop her. Together they tried to save the boy, but it was too late. When the breath left his body, the warrior bowed his head. The woman stepped back, giving him space. He sat there for a long time, silent and still, before turning his eyes toward the mountains. There was no anger in his face, only resolve. Then he looked at her, as if to say the storm she feared had only just begun. Far off, another column of smoke rose into the sky, and the sound of riders echoed faintly once more. The valley was no longer just her home. It had become a crossing point between two worlds at war, and standing on that porch, with the warrior beside her and the dead boy at their feet, she knew there was no way to stay untouched by it anymore. The boy's body lay wrapped in a blanket near the edge of the cabin. The woman had done what she could, closed his eyes, covered him, and whispered a quiet prayer she hadn't spoken since her husband's death. The wounded Apache warrior stood beside her in silence, his jaw set, his gaze distant. He hadn't moved for a long time, his hand still resting on the earth as if waiting for it to give him an answer. The morning sun climbed higher, and the valley shimmered with heat, but the stillness between them felt cold and heavy. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there before he finally looked up. His eyes met hers, dark and steady, and for the first time she saw what lay beneath his silence: grief, anger, and a question that needed no translation. Why had this happened? Who had done it? She didn't have the answer, but she knew it was tied to whatever battle had started in the hills. He pointed toward the smoke rising in the distance, then drew a line across his throat. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. He was telling her death was coming this way. Her stomach tightened. If soldiers were driving the Apache down from the mountains, they'd reach her valley before sundown. The warrior motioned toward the boy's body, and then toward the hills again. He wanted to bury the young man before leaving. She nodded, and together they carried him to a quiet spot near the creek where the cottonwoods grew. The water whispered softly as they dug. She handed him her shovel, but he refused it and used his hands instead, scooping dirt in silence. There was something sacred in the way he worked, something that didn't need words. When they finished, he placed a small carved token on the mound, a wooden bird with spread wings, and bowed his head. As he stood, she saw the exhaustion in his body. The wound she'd treated before had reopened slightly, and a dark stain spread across his side. He swayed for a moment, catching himself on the shovel handle. She went to his side, offering support. For an instant, he hesitated, pride flashing in his eyes, but then he allowed her to help him back to the cabin. Inside, she boiled water and tore fresh cloth for bandages. As she cleaned the wound, he watched her with quiet curiosity. When she pressed the cloth to his side, he didn't flinch. There was trust there now, thin but real. After she finished, he said a single word she didn't understand, then pointed toward her chest. She thought he was trying to tell her something about herself, maybe her courage. Outside, the dog began barking. She froze, hand instinctively reaching for her rifle. The warrior turned toward the window, his expression tightening. They both moved to the door carefully. Through the cracks in the fence, she saw figures approaching from the west, 3 riders in dust-covered coats. Not Apache, soldiers. Her pulse jumped. The warrior stepped back from the window, his hand gripping his knife. She whispered for him to stay still, though she knew he couldn't understand. He stayed close to the shadows, his breathing quiet. The riders slowed as they neared the cabin, scanning the property. The one in front wore a blue coat faded from sun and dirt. "A sergeant, maybe," he called out, asking if anyone was home. His voice was friendly enough, but there was something sharp underneath it, a tone she had learned to recognize when men came looking for something they already knew the answer to. She opened the door slightly, keeping her body between them and the inside. The soldier tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am. You alone out here?" She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Been alone a while. Just tending to my place." He leaned in his saddle, glancing past her toward the open door. "You hear any gunfire last night? We're tracking a band of Apache that came through these hills. One of 'em's wounded. You seen anything?" Her throat went dry. She shook her head. "Just coyotes. They've been restless lately." He studied her face. The second soldier rode closer, eyes narrowing as he looked around the yard. His gaze stopped on the fresh mound near the creek. "You bury something, ma'am?" Her heart stumbled. "Lost a calf 2 nights ago. Coyotes got it." The man nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. The sergeant spat into the dirt. "If you see anything or anyone passing through, you best let us know. They're dangerous. Last week they killed a rancher and his family north of here." She said nothing, only nodded again. When they finally turned their horses and rode off toward the ridge, her knees felt weak with relief. She shut the door fast and turned to the warrior. He was standing by the hearth, silent, his knife still in his hand. His eyes told her he had understood enough. He moved to the window, watching until the soldiers disappeared. Then he looked back at her with something that wasn't gratitude. It was warning. He pointed toward the hills again, then to the north as if telling her more soldiers would come. She understood now that she wasn't just caught in the middle of his fight, she was part of it. The rest of the day passed under a tense silence. She couldn't focus on her chores. Every sound, the wind, the creak of the gate, the rustle of dry leaves made her jump. The warrior stayed near the window, alert and still as a shadow. She could tell he was listening too, reading the land in ways she couldn't. Toward evening, clouds gathered over the mountains, and thunder rolled across the valley. The air smelled like rain and gunpowder. When the first drops began to fall, he went outside, lifting his face to the sky as if welcoming it. She watched from the doorway, wondering who he had been before the blood and the chase. Was he a leader, a son, a brother? The boy they buried had called him something before dying, a name she couldn't forget. That night, the rain poured hard, beating against the roof. She lay awake, listening. The warrior sat near the window, keeping watch. When lightning flashed, she saw his profile, calm but tense, his hand resting on the knife handle. Sometime past midnight, the dog growled again. She sat up. The warrior motioned for silence. Then she heard it too, the faint creak of leather, the muffled thud of hooves in wet ground. Someone was out there. She doused the lamp. Together they moved to the back wall, peering through a gap in the boards. Shapes moved in the darkness, 3 men, maybe 4. Not soldiers this time. Their movements were too quiet, too careful. Raiders or scouts. The warrior gripped her arm lightly, guiding her back inside. He whispered something, his tone low and urgent. She didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Stay still. The figures came closer. One of them stepped onto the porch, boots squishing in the mud. The latch rattled softly. Her heart thundered. The door creaked, and before she could breathe, the warrior moved. In a blur, he grabbed his bow and notched an arrow. When the door swung open, he fired. The arrow struck the wood beside the intruder's head, and the man stumbled back, shouting. Gunfire exploded outside. She ducked as bullets tore through the walls. The dog barked furiously. The warrior moved fast, pushing the table over for cover. He signaled her to stay low and reloaded his bow with steady hands. The fight lasted only moments but felt endless. When the last shot faded, rain filled the silence. She crawled to the window and looked out. 2 figures lay motionless near the fence, and the others had fled into the dark. The warrior stood still, scanning the distance before lowering his bow. His breathing was heavy, but his focus hadn't broken. She could see the conflict written in his face. He hadn't wanted to fight, but the fight had come anyway. When dawn came, the valley was covered in mist. The rain had washed away the tracks, but the bodies remained. She helped him drag them out beyond the creek, her hands shaking with exhaustion. They buried them without words. As the sun rose, she looked around her land, now scarred with bullet holes and broken wood. She realized her quiet life was gone. The valley had become a place of war. The warrior stood beside her, silent as ever. But when their eyes met, she saw the truth neither of them could deny. They were bound together now, by fate and by danger. He turned toward the hills again, as if hearing something she couldn't. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder echoed, not from the sky this time, but from the march of horses. The army was coming, and deep in her chest, she felt it too. The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning sun rose behind the smoky horizon, turning the mist above the valley into pale gold. The cabin looked smaller than ever against the open land, scarred by bullet holes and footprints. The woman stood at the doorway, gripping the frame as if it could hold back what she feared was coming. The Apache warrior was already outside, moving silently through the tall grass, scanning the ridge with the eyes of a hunter. He had barely slept. His movements were steady but urgent, like a man counting the last calm breaths before a storm. She watched him with unease. Each day since the soldiers and raiders had come, the air had grown heavier, filled with the kind of stillness that precedes disaster. The valley was no longer just her home. It had become a crossing ground between enemies, and she was caught in the middle. The warrior returned to the porch, his expression unreadable, and pointed toward the east. Dust hung over the horizon like a low cloud. He didn't have to say a word. She knew what that meant. More riders were coming. Her hands trembled as she began to gather supplies, water, dried meat, bullets for her old rifle. The warrior moved quickly too, checking the cabin's windows and reinforcing the door with planks. There was no panic in him, only purpose. When she looked at him, she saw the same quiet determination that had first made her trust him. He wasn't fighting for revenge alone. He was fighting for survival. By noon, the sound of horses began to echo faintly through the valley. The warrior climbed the slope behind the cabin to watch. She followed him halfway up, careful not to draw attention. When they reached a rocky outcrop, she could see them, lines of soldiers riding through the dust, their blue coats flashing in the sunlight, rifles slung across their shoulders. It wasn't a patrol this time. It was an army column, maybe 50 men moving slow and deliberate. Behind them rolled a wagon and the long barrel of a small field cannon. She felt her heart sink. "They're not just passing through," she whispered. "They're coming here." The warrior didn't answer. He crouched low, watching their movements carefully. From his look, she could tell he was already planning something. An escape, maybe an ambush or both. He motioned toward the western hills where the tree line thickened. If they could reach that cover before the soldiers crossed the valley, they might have a chance. But leaving wasn't simple. Her horse was still weak from the night before, and the trail west crossed open ground with no shelter. If they were seen, the army would cut them down before they reached the woods. She looked back toward the cabin, her only home, and then toward the warrior. "If we go, we can't come back," she said softly. He met her eyes for a long moment, then nodded. He understood. They returned to the cabin in silence. The warrior packed his few belongings, his bow, a handful of arrows, the carved bird he had taken from the boy's grave. She gathered what food and water she could carry. The air outside was dry and restless. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper danger. They had almost finished when the dog barked sharply from the edge of the yard. The warrior froze. The woman looked out through the window and saw movement near the fence. 2 riders breaking ahead of the main group, scouts. Their silhouettes cut across the sunlight as they rode closer, stopping near the creek. One dismounted, scanning the area with binoculars. The other pointed toward the cabin. Her breath caught. The warrior slipped toward the back door, signaling her to stay down. He moved with a silent grace, stepping into the tall grass and disappearing behind the barn. The woman gripped her rifle and waited, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could see one of the scouts now, a young soldier with a dust-covered hat and a face that looked too clean for war. He tied his horse near the fence and started walking toward the porch. She backed up slowly, the rifle steady but shaking in her hands. The door creaked open just as his boots hit the first step. He looked up, surprised to see her standing there alone. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you should clear out." "There's going to be trouble here." She forced herself to sound calm. "What kind of trouble?" Before he could answer, a sharp sound cut through the air. A shout from the other soldier by the creek. The young man turned his head just as an arrow whistled out of the grass and struck the ground beside him. He stumbled back, hand going for his revolver, but before he could fire, the warrior emerged from behind the barn and tackled him to the ground. The rifle clattered away. The 2 men struggled, the soldier swinging wildly, the warrior moving with precision and speed. The woman froze, torn between fear and instinct. She ran forward, shouting for them to stop, but the fight ended as quickly as it began. The soldier lay on his back, breathing but dazed, the warrior kneeling beside him with the knife poised. She shouted again, louder this time, her voice breaking. The warrior hesitated, eyes flicking toward her, then lowered the blade. For a long second, none of them moved. Then the warrior grabbed the soldier's rifle, smashed it against the post, and tossed the broken pieces into the mud. He tied the man's hands with a strip of rope and dragged him toward the barn, out of sight from the road. The woman followed, her hands still trembling. "What are you going to do with him?" she asked. The warrior didn't answer. He crouched beside the soldier, checking his pockets, taking his knife and map. When he unrolled the map, she saw red markings circling the valley, their location, the trail to the hills, even the small creek by her land. Her blood ran cold. They weren't searching randomly. They knew exactly where to find him. The warrior's eyes hardened. He pointed at the red circle and then to himself, making a cutting motion across his chest. She understood. They were hunting him. The sound of gunfire echoed from the ridge before she could speak. A signal shot. The soldiers had found the scouts' horses. Within minutes, the valley erupted with noise, shouting, galloping, the metallic clatter of weapons. The warrior's gaze snapped to the west. They were surrounded. He moved fast, grabbing his bow and a handful of arrows, motioning for her to follow. She ran after him toward the back of the property. Bullets tore through the fence as they ducked behind the shed. The soldier in the barn shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by gunfire. Smoke filled the air. They crawled through the tall grass, inching toward the creek. The warrior's movements were quick and precise, guiding her with hand signals. She followed his lead, heart pounding so hard it hurt. When they reached the water, they splashed through it quietly and took cover behind the fallen log on the other side. The air smelled of gunpowder and wet earth. The soldiers fanned out, shouting orders. Some searched the barn, others the cabin. Flames began to lick the porch as one of them set fire to it. The woman bit her lip to keep from crying out. The home she had built, the only thing left of her old life, was burning. The warrior's face was stone. He watched the soldiers spread out and whispered something under his breath, a prayer or a promise. Then he pointed toward the northern ridge where the trees grew thicker. If they could reach the cover of the forest, they might disappear. But between them and the ridge stretched open ground. He looked at her, then at the burning cabin. His eyes said what words couldn't. They had to run now or die here. She nodded. Together they waited for a moment of distraction. When a gust of smoke rolled across the field and the soldiers turned toward the fire, the warrior grabbed her hand and ran. They dashed through the grass, bent low, the sound of gunfire bursting behind them. Bullets hissed past, one striking a stone near her feet. She stumbled, but he caught her arm and pulled her forward. They reached the first line of trees just as another volley tore through the clearing. The warrior spun and fired an arrow, striking one of the soldiers who had spotted them. Then they ran deeper into the woods, their breath ragged, their clothes soaked with sweat and ash. Behind them, the valley glowed orange from the burning cabin. Smoke curled into the sky like a dark banner. The woman glanced back once, tears stinging her eyes. Everything she had ever known was disappearing in the flames. They didn't stop until the sun began to fade. The forest grew darker, filled with the hum of crickets and the far-off howl of wolves. The warrior finally slowed, listening to the wind. Then he motioned for her to stop. He crouched low, pointing toward the north. Through the trees, faint torchlight flickered. Dozens of lights moving through the shadows. More soldiers, maybe more raiders. They had been waiting beyond the ridge. She looked at him, her chest tight. "We can't go that way." He nodded grimly. The sound of drums began to rise in the distance, low and rhythmic. It wasn't the army this time, it was his people. The Apache were returning. They were trapped between two fires. The soldiers on one side, his own warriors on the other. And as the drums grew louder, she realized the next choice they made could cost both their lives. The valley had turned into a battlefield, and the night was far from over. The night was alive with the sound of drums echoing through the forest, slow and haunting, carried by the wind. The woman stood beside the Apache warrior, both breathing hard, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dirt and smoke. Behind them, the glow of the burning cabin still reached faintly through the trees, a reminder of what they had lost. In front of them, scattered torchlight flickered like fireflies through the pines, the rhythm of hooves and chanting rising from beyond the ridge. Between the army and the Apache, there was no place left to hide. For a long moment, neither spoke. The warrior crouched low, listening to the sound patterns like a man who could read the forest as others read a map. He pointed toward the east, where a narrow ravine cut through the rocks, half hidden by brush. The woman nodded. She trusted his instincts now more than her own. They moved quietly, every step careful, every breath measured. The forest floor was slick with rain and ash. She stumbled once, catching herself on a branch. The warrior turned and caught her arm before she could fall. His touch was firm, steadying, and his eyes met hers with a silent promise. He would not let her die here. That brief look gave her strength to keep going. As they crept down into the ravine, the drums grew louder. Shouts echoed through the hills, followed by gunfire. The army had reached the Apache lines. The woman froze at the sound, feeling the ground tremble beneath her feet. It was chaos, distant but closing in. The warrior motioned for her to stay behind him, his bow ready. They waited in the shadows, the sound of battle washing over them from both sides. Then came a scream, sharp and human, cutting through the noise. The warrior stiffened. The cry had come from nearby. Not a soldier, not an Apache, but a boy's voice. He looked at her, eyes wide, and darted toward the sound before she could stop him. She followed close behind, crashing through the brush until they reached a small clearing. There, caught between fallen logs, was a young Apache child, no older than 12, his leg pinned under a broken branch. He looked up in fear as they appeared, his small knife trembling in his hand. The warrior knelt beside him, speaking softly in his language. The boy's eyes widened as he recognized him, and he lowered the knife. Together they lifted the branch and freed his leg. The woman tore a strip from her skirt to wrap around the wound. The child clung to the warrior's arm, tears cutting through the dirt on his face. She didn't understand the words they exchanged, but she could feel the bond between them. Family, tribe, or something deeper. When they turned to move again, they heard horses approaching fast. The warrior grabbed his bow, pushing the boy behind the rocks. She held her rifle tight, her heart pounding. Two riders burst through the trees, soldiers, their faces grim, rifles raised. The first shot cracked the air. She fired back, her bullet striking the man's shoulder, sending him spinning from his horse. The other soldier wheeled around, firing wildly. The warrior moved like lightning, an arrow flying from his bow and striking the second rider before he could reload. The man fell hard, his horse bolting into the trees. The clearing fell silent again except for the boy's ragged breathing. The warrior looked at the fallen soldiers, then at her. His expression was hard, but there was no triumph in it, only weariness. He motioned toward the ravine. They had to keep moving before the rest of the soldiers came. By dawn, they reached the river at the base of the valley. The fog clung low and the air smelled of wet earth and smoke. The child limped beside them, holding tightly to the warrior's hand. They found shelter beneath a rocky overhang where the forest opened toward the plains. From there, they could see the valley far below, the burning wreck of the cabin, the flashes of battle between blue uniforms and painted riders, the land torn apart by men who would never understand each other. The woman sank to her knees, exhausted. Her body ached, but it wasn't just from the running. She was watching her life burn away in that valley. Every memory she'd built since her husband died. The farm, the cabin, the little piece of peace she had found. It was gone. She felt hollow, as if the wind could pass straight through her. The warrior stood beside her, silent for a long time. Then he reached into the pouch at his side and took out the small carved bird he had placed on the boy's grave. He held it out to her. At first she shook her head, not understanding, but he pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. His eyes softened, and he spoke quietly, pointing toward the rising sun. She didn't understand his words, but she understood the meaning. Life would continue. The land would heal. They stayed hidden by the river until the fighting above faded to silence. The child slept, his head resting on the woman's lap. The warrior kept watch, listening for any sound that might mean danger. But the valley was quiet now. Smoke drifted like ghosts across the plains. By afternoon, the wind changed. The sound of hooves echoed faintly from the north. A handful of Apache riders appeared through the trees, their faces solemn, their clothes marked by the dust of battle. They approached slowly, their eyes moving from the woman to the child, then to the warrior. One of them spoke softly, and the warrior nodded. The leader dismounted and placed a hand on the warrior's shoulder. There was respect between them, deep, wordless understanding. The woman stepped back, sensing she was witnessing something private. The warrior turned to her and gave a single nod, a silent farewell. He pointed toward the trail leading east, the one that led back toward the settlements. She knew he was telling her to go while she still could. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to stay, to see him safe, to find out if the boy's tribe would survive what was coming. But she also knew that this was his world, not hers. She belonged to a different one, a world that had taken everything but still demanded she endure. He looked at her one last time, and for the first time since they met, he smiled. It was faint, almost uncertain, but it held warmth. Then he turned away, lifting the boy onto one of the horses. The others followed him into the trees, their forms fading into the distance until only the sound of hooves remained. The woman stood there a long time after they disappeared. The river glimmered under the sunlight, calm and endless. The valley behind her was scarred, yet somehow beautiful in its ruin. She thought about everything that had happened, the wounded warrior she had saved, the riders who surrounded her cabin, the soldiers, the fear, the fire. It all seemed distant now, like a story told by the land itself. When she finally started walking east, she carried little with her, just her rifle, a small pack, and the carved wooden bird in her pocket. The road was long and empty, but she didn't feel alone. She could still hear the echo of the drums behind her, fading slowly, mixing with the whisper of the wind through the pines. By the time the sun began to set, she reached a ridge overlooking the plains. From there she could see the horizon stretching forever, wild and open. For the first time in a long while, she let herself breathe deeply. The past had burned away, but she was still standing. She had learned something from the warrior she could never forget, that mercy, even in the harshest land, had power. She turned once more toward the west, where the last traces of smoke were rising, and whispered a quiet prayer, not for herself, but for the man who had changed her fate. Then she faced the road ahead and walked on, the golden light falling over her shoulders. The wind carried her steps forward, soft and steady, as the valley behind her fell into silence once again. The land would remember the fire, the battle, and the bond that had grown between a settler and a warrior who should have been enemies. But it would also remember something else, the kindness of a woman who gave water to a wounded Apache, and how that single act of mercy rippled across the valley like a heartbeat that refused to fade.